It's like a dressing up. Oh, it's telling us.
Sick. Well, without further ado, I would like to invite up the first speaker of the affirming team.
Sure. The way we're going to win today's debate on our side is by maintaining consistent consumer confidence or producer strength. I'm going to be starting with some framing before going into my first point about how we benefit in times of crisis, and my second point about how we actually benefit in the everyday living. But to start with some framing then, first of all, our model, we're going to be subsidizing domestic production and building our national reserves as laid out by the info slide, right? And for some framing here, you can't control like external factors in the world economically, but you can control internal factors, and there will always be downshifts in the global economy of varying sizes just due to unpredictable factors generally, right? Like think COVID or 2008 with the housing recession, right? And these will always reflect onto NZ economically, right? Because we are undeniably interlinked with the global economy, right? So we value consistency through resilience because one, it means people don't get uprooted during times of crisis, which we think is important. And second, it means businesses feel safer during these times of crisis, so they don't have to like shut down and stuff like that, right? So what is a time of crisis, right? And how does it impact? Well, it's when foreign businesses are going to raise prices to recoup the lost profit, because generally these times of crisis are caused by a shock to a common good that raises prices for businesses across the board. For example, an oil shock where prices for oil go up, right? And that raises the costs for every business when their own transportation, fueling their truck costs more, right? And that's like a global cost that leads on to every business. Times normalcy, it's just like a stable situation, costs are not increasing. So, times of crisis, right? Here's some context. New Zealand is an isolated nation. It takes a long time to get here from any other country in the world, which means that it's actually really expensive for us to import goods because you have to pay a lot extra for like refueling your ships, but also it just takes a really long time. So you actually want to, that means on exporting, since it takes so long, you want to buy from someone else because you don't have to accommodate for that increased cost of fuel for those ships, right? And we save money. We have like a stable economy. We're not doing debt-based growth, so we're going to have large reserves, right? So first of all, we actually reduce debt because we've been saving money. We're saving money under a consistent economy, which means we can use that money to act as a cushion when we have like large national reserves, which means during crisis, we don't actually have to go into debt to help recuperate, right? Second of all, it guarantees income for producers, right? When the government is subsidizing producers, they have a guaranteed income floor for their goods. They don't have to fear shutting down when the fuel for their harvester goes up, and then they have to either raise prices, and then if no one buys them, they have to like shut down. They don't have to fear that anymore, right? And this means, third of all, it guarantees lower prices for consumers, right? When producers receive these subsidies to offset rising costs during crisis, that means they don't need to raise prices. Why is this? Well, competition, right? Businesses receiving the subsidy can lower their prices to attract consumers, right? Which means they make more when more people are buying their stuff. This will happen until we reach that beautiful equilibrium price. God bless level 2 economics. So what we have the impact here is, first of all, on producers, they don't need to cut costs. So at the low level, this is just like laying off a few people, right? But at the higher level, this looks like just completely shutting down, right? They don't need to make that trade-off anymore. They can just keep all these workers and remain open, which means they're still providing their goods and services to the country, right? But the comparative here is that when you don't subsidize these businesses, they just have to shut down or lay off those workers, as I've laid out. And this is like particularly important during times of crisis because it's really hard to actually start a business if everything around you is costing so much more, which means there's no way for another business to like fill in the gap. They literally cannot expand because they do not have the resourcing to do so. And on consumers, right, now that they have lower prices, it means like, you know, those middle class citizens, they're not struggling to like afford their luxury television they really want. But it means not for, especially like lower class people, they're not struggling to eat when prices are like raising for basic essential goods like bread, right? That consistent confidence in spending means that we don't have to like, and on the government, with consistent confidence in spending, it means we don't actually have to spend any time recovering in the first place from a time of crisis. Like life goes on, right? The comparative here is in their world, you're likely to see consumers that are struggling to make ends meet, they're struggling to spend, which means how do you recover if no one's even spending on goods in the economy? You can't get that money to start recirculating, right? So their times of crisis actually last longer as well. Now before I move on, I'll take a point.
When you tell us that consumers can't afford stuff when it's only bread, when people only make $23 an hour, don't you think that a $2 to $3 difference makes a huge amount?
We think that like in your world, people just won't have a job in the first place, right? So how are they going to afford like this bread during a time of crisis, right? And as I move into here, this will also partially rebut that as well. So everyday living, right? So first of all, we think under everyday living with these policies, people save more, right? Let's look at consumer confidence. It's not going to be as high comparatively, and why that is a good thing during everyday living. Well, the government isn't aiming to maximize production, so that means that while confident, you're not as like confident as like when the government's spending to maximize that production, right? Because you're not like consistently guaranteed that like it's going to be like a straight vertical line upwards. So you're not maximally confident. So it means when consumers are uncertain, they're actually more likely to save because they don't know what could be happening next, right? So they're a bit more likely to save and know that we still have consumer confidence. So it's not massive, right? But it's still very important. And second of all, we actually get a lot of diversification because when we subsidize businesses in NZ, it gives them more incentive to first of all open their doors, right? Because we're raising their profit margins on which they operate. But that means for the business, they actually now have an incentive to just pay more to their workers, right? We think this is very important because a lot of businesses in NZ struggle due to the brain drain. Skilled workers are just leaving overseas for better pay, so these businesses can't even get a start, right? So they actually start paying more because if like workers are not making as much as they productively like provide, right? Like they produce at $30 an hour, they're worth $30 an hour, right? And if you're not receiving that, then other businesses can then just afford to raise like wages, right? Because you're not like, I explained it. So that means that like you can poach workers, right? You're competing for these workers because they'll just move to the one that pays them as close as possible to what they produce. Yes. So, and then when they have more workers, they also just make more profit because you have more people making things for you. Okay, impacts here then is, first of all, consumers are ready for all sorts of disaster. This means a disaster like a surprise dentist appointment at the lower scale. They now have funds stored away for that. But also if something long-term happens to them, maybe they break a leg, maybe they have like just a long-term illness, right? They're more prepared for that because they have money stored away. And they're more prepared for times of crisis at the larger scale, which means that consumers are always ready for when something bad could happen, right? They're ready to spend, they have that money stored away to buy that bread in the first place. They have money stored away to like mend that tooth, right? Which means that they're also just doing better in general. They're more productive because they don't have to like spend time worrying about whether or not they should even go to the dentist. Like they have money stored away, so they can just make that decision, right? And we're also stronger economically because we're retaining people who left, which means we're not paying. These are people that would not be paying taxes or producing anything instead, and we spent money educating them, which means overall economically we're not just built on like the primary industries, which means if their market undergoes like serious hardship, it means we're more resilient and consistent. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the first speaker of the negating team.
side affirming's impact on the fact that people can now pay for like short-term appointments literally does not engage in the motion at all, because how does a national reserve going to increase the amount of money someone saves so that they can store this to pay for a medical appointment? This simply does not make sense. Firstly on setup, then onto the benefit for consumers, then secondly on economic stability, and Jumana will extend on the producers. Firstly on setup then, I note that they never gave us a full layout or illustration of what the two worlds actually look like, right? So what does it look like when we have a focus on efficiency? Firstly, it looks like lowering the barriers to trade and tariffs on these certain goods. Secondly, it looks like encouraging competition with policies to allow for more businesses to enter into the market. Thirdly, it looks like putting money into our industries like agriculture, renewable energy or tourism, where New Zealand has that comparative advantage to other countries. Comparatively, resilience-orientated policies looks like one, restricting imports and exports within dairy and other products. Secondly, it looks like what New Zealand currently looks like. Firstly, I think people are in a cost of living crisis, right? People are suffering with the post-COVID like high food prices. New Zealand is in debt because they had to borrow a lot of money during COVID. I think this is a significant harm. So if we can improve the lives of the consumers, then we win this debate. Okay, firstly onto the benefit of consumers. I think this is the most important stakeholder in this debate because they are the workers, the ones who keep the economy running, and they buy products and need to afford or have access to these products in order to survive. I think firstly, we are able to lower prices for many reasons. The first one is that we increase the competition, right? We lower the barriers to entry such that like there are tax breaks for new firms or businesses that allow for them to join the industry. This means you have more people in the market. Secondly, you trade with like other nations, which allows us to get the cheapest possible product, right? We're able to reduce the tariffs on the products in New Zealand, like doesn't have the same capability to produce. This looks like medical equipment because New Zealand is not involved in that industry with little investment, little potential because of the medical brain drain. Thirdly, the products that New Zealand does primarily produce are also produced in other countries. So now you have this incentive to compete with those products that are produced in other countries, which means that both international and national products or like domestic products are priced down so that more people can afford this. Comparatively, they have far higher prices, right? Because firstly, they're restricting trade even for products that New Zealand is best for producing. They're likely to have those high prices with the lack of development in the industry, meaning that they have these really high fixed costs that drive up the cost for consumers because both the foreign and domestic products now are really expensive. Secondly, they get less competition on a local scale in particular because the barriers to entry are so high. It means that new firms are no longer able to enter this industry. This looks like Fonterra producing most of New Zealand's dairy products, and now smaller businesses who want to try get into this industry no longer have the money to like buy up land or get those farmers from Fonterra to work for them because they aren't able to afford it in the first place. Secondly, I think we increase the availability and choice for the consumers, right? Because firstly, there's more output because more firms are in the market, so they compete by producing as many goods as they can sell. Secondly, the lower fixed costs with the barriers like tariffs are like are removed, so products can be produced cheaper and also on a greater scale. Thirdly, when there's none of more firms, they have an incentive to make unique products that stand out in the market because they want to get more consumers and build a loyal consumer base. Comparatively, they get far less ability and far less choice when they limit the means of foreign products and imports because they are now high-priced domestic products and foreign products that are also priced really high. Thirdly, we touted that we get an increase in the quality of our products, right? Because firstly, they have the same amount of competition, for the same competition mechanism. That means that businesses have the incentive to innovate their products so that people can get the best quality products that they want. Secondly, we tell you that foreign products might be better than what is produced locally, which means that people can get the best for what is needed. This looks like treating medical things or for doctors in the best possible way. What do they tell us here then? They told us that consumers are confident on their side because they're able to save. Firstly, I think regardless, the most vulnerable people in our society don't have the capacity to save in the first place. They're running by the check. They pay the money that they can to get the necessities. So we think saving doesn't actually apply to most people, especially during a time of crisis. Secondly, saving is not is not a good thing for the economy, because when you have less spending, this means that you get less revenue for firms and you get less output, and therefore less economic growth. That means people actually lose their jobs. This is super harmful in an economic crisis. The impacts of this is that in the current cost of living crisis, it looks like single mothers who have to work multiple jobs and have to put food on the table now getting that food for cheaper. We think for them, when they're making $23 an hour, like at the maximum, they're probably working so many jobs. There's like $2 difference cost in bread that they have to buy every day for like their 3 or 4 children is a massive harm for them. She could be spending this on better quality, more nutritious food, or getting more food in general to feed her children. We think these are the harms where the people of New Zealand are suffered so drastically during COVID, where their businesses are being shut down, where they are unable to afford their products, that we allow them to save in the first place. We allow them to get the best possible products, or at least products of the cheapest prices. I think we can win this debate when we show that we're able to get people higher quality goods, or goods that are more accessible, especially in times of crisis where people stock up low in supply, or if it's at a lower price so they can actually afford it. Secondly then, on economic stability. Before that, I'll take a POI.
How does your side avoid insanely high inflation rates?
We avoid insanely high inflation rates when we get higher GDP. We're able to actually get people the amount of money, and we literally have low prices, as I just proved. Okay, secondly, on economic stability, I think firstly, people now have lower costs in which they have a greater disposable income that they can spend on luxuries that supports more businesses, right? Secondly, when output increases, the GDP also increases because A, you have more products that are being produced and bought, and secondly, you also have a greater employment as more businesses now enter the market, which means that you get more workers that are active economically in buying. Note that most of their material contingents on the fact that there is a huge economic shock. What we do when it's efficient now in an economic crisis as well is we're able to lower those prices. When you think about an actual economic crisis, this on their side, it has to be so harmful for you to get any of the impacts that they try to prove to you. And for example, if you're going into, we tell you that people are going to be more economically active when they go and have a job. They're able to actually purchase things. But fourthly, because you reduce the impact of these economic shocks, right? Because A, more people actually have the ability to save with a more stable income. Say that prices are cheaper, more people are able to save, and they've uniquely been able to work in this more dynamic economy on our side. But secondly, because the people are less susceptible to the price shocks, because they're able to adjust to the increased prices. They told us that the producers don't need to cut costs. Firstly, they never told us how these subsidies have the capacity to give this money to these businesses when they have such little amount in an economic crisis for the government to actually save up to pay out to these people. They also told us that consumers can't afford and it's just bread. This makes a huge impact when people are making so little money in an economic crisis.
I thank the speakers for their speech and would like to invite up the second speaker of the affirmative meeting.
We've heard it all before about competition somehow magically fixing things for consumers. So at my point in today's debate, let's characterise once and for all what consumers want, why they are afraid of recessions, and why they are afraid of that side of the house, and so why we inherently do better for them. In my speech today, I'll be doing that characterisation, I'll be doing some rebuttal. Then I'll be delivering some meta on what they actually have to prove versus like the levels of our argument in today's debate. And then I'm going to be delivering some like new substantive framing upon our first point, some long-term analysis and some likelihood analysis upon that. Okay, so what do consumers want? We can broadly agree that consumers just want to get by. The average consumer is probably, as they've said, like a single mother working 3 jobs. Maybe not, but the average consumer needs to work a wage to earn a living. The average consumer is struggling during the recession that we are in right now. So what this means is that any given consumer at any given time is going to always be afraid of these downturns. They're going to be worried about their job security. They're going to be worried about the debt of their country. So at the point in today's debate where we can prove how national reserves fix some of that debt, why subsidies are likely to let that woman keep her job and retain her livelihood, we are winning. Okay, rebuttal now. So the first thing which we hear them say, the first speaker obviously thought this was a bit of a gotcha moment, right? Because it was their intro. But when they say, how do reserves save spending? We can easily defeat this with 2 responses that Riley's given you. I'll give you some more. So essentially, obviously reserves save spending, as Riley told you, clearly mechanised, because it prevents the country from going into debt when inevitably there is an emergency. 2 new responses, just for that sweet substantive as well, flag that edge. Okay, first new response. Consumers are going to save more because they aren't overconfident during a boom. On your side, maybe you will get a boom. You will get that equivalent of in the 80s when the fourth Labour government came in and they deregulated everything. Sorry for politics broing during an economics debate. But in the 80s, everyone and their dad invested into oil. They were this is so great. The market is going to be good forever. And then it wasn't, and they were all buggered. So they had to be not too confident during that boom. When you get that boom, when you get that overconfidence, you are going to treat consumers worse in the long run. Second new response. On our side, lower prices gives more money to consumers. So when we can prevent inflation by reducing the debt of a country, we are going to be giving more money to the consumers because they're paying less at the petrol pump, paying less at the grocery store, and when they're not overconfident, more of this money is going to be saved. So boom, I proved the incentive and the capability of consumers to save on our side of the house as opposed to theirs. When we prove that, we are inherently already winning on consumers, which is probably going to be one of the clashes I'll tell you about later. Next thing they say is that we're not getting the maximum potential on our best products. What we tell you is that actually we would much prefer it. We don't think that if other companies offshore are scared of New Zealand's economic status, we don't think they are going to be investing in us, doing much trade with us. They then start to talk about smaller businesses. So I think this is important to characterise what they want. Why is a smaller business uniquely different to a big business? They have more to be afraid of. If a recession comes, a big business is going to be fine. A small business is probably more likely to not be fine. So at that point, they are afraid of high inflation. They are afraid of large government debt. They are afraid of going under. So subsidies on their domestic production and a national reserve to keep national debt down is going to be something that they would like. Next, we hear this argument about better choice, this kind of comes in 2 prongs, both of which were probably delivered by Ruth Richardson in this room a long time ago. Firstly, there are more companies, which is going to result in more choice for consumers. Note that this is contingent on their idea about smaller businesses being able to enter the market, which we don't think is likely if there is a perception that the market is a much more dangerous place to be on your side of the house. Also, the same mix I've just given you about smaller businesses applies, so we defeat that first mechanism. The next one is about cheaper cost. So why would they make less money? Why would a CEO choose to make less money? We think that lowering the costs, if you are one of the big supermarkets, just because all of a sudden it's cheaper for you to produce things because of regulations, we don't think you have an incentive to lower costs. This is how we ended up with the supermarket duopoly in New Zealand. Even at the point that they do lower their costs, we actually think, here's what happens. Less regulation means they're probably going to cut corners on their product to cost save, then they maximise their profit, and they're guaranteed to make money. This just results in monopoly, results in worse quality products, so even if you buy, they get better choices. More choices. They're just more choices of worse products. So happy to stand for our side on that point. Next piece of rebuttal, they say competition looks better for consumers. Again, this is also contingent on all the stuff that we've heard about more businesses entering the market. I've already proven why that doesn't happen, and about better choice, and I've just proven why that doesn't happen. Next they say consumers don't save, so it doesn't, like saving is irrelevant to this debate and it doesn't apply. Not under your world they don't save, under ours they do. Why? Because they're not afraid, they're not overconfident during booms, and they have more money in the pocket from the petrol pump, from the grocery checkout, and they are likely to save that. Again, single mother characterisation, working 3 jobs. This is who we are looking after. We are seeking to protect the workers. When recession happens, or there is a threat of recession, it is the single mother who stands to lose her job because the company she is working for goes under, or they stop importing things from overseas. I'll take a point.
Right. Do you not think that the single mother is more fearful of her affording food now than a potential risk she could see in the future?
Right, so in the future, if there is a recession, she is going to be struggling to afford food now. So this short-term, long-term analysis that they're trying to weigh out of the debate doesn't apply here. I'll be talking more about this later on. Okay, so now a bit of meta in the debate about what they have to prove. They have to prove why Aotearoa is a suitable location to test an economic experiment that has failed in the best of places. It has failed here before. So in order to defeat our points, they have to defeat 3 main tiers of logic that we're giving. Firstly, on characterisation. We told you New Zealand is too isolated, that our trading partners are too volatile, and that our exports are too time sensitive, think of agriculture, in order to justify this experiment. Next, we mechanised how we much prefer a world where a reserve helps prevent debt, where subsidies help prevent job loss. And then finally, on the weighing, we say even if you get more competition and more choice, we would just much rather have that security. Yeah, you might get the highest of booms, but at the point where you get the lowest of lows, we win on the weighing because we think it is far more important that the more vulnerable people, the workers, are always going to have that job, are always going to be in a country without too much debt. So we win on the characterisation because it went broadly uncontested, we win on the mix, and we win on the weighing. What we need to hear from them is to get up and defeat all of our mix and all of our impacting and weighing about that. Okay, now for my substantive. Firstly, let's do some comparative analysis with a bit of context that New Zealand has no control over global economic conditions. There could be a recession at any moment. If the recession happens next year, on their side of the house, businesses are going to fail. Workers are going to lose their job. And then, after all of that, their government is going to have to spend more on recovery. If a recession happens in 10 years on their side of the house, it's the exact same. If a recession happens next year on our side of the house, we are at least marginally better than them because we lose less jobs, because we are less reliant on exports, because of the subsidies. This saves businesses, saves jobs, saves the workers. But where we really win, where we pull ahead in this debate, is on the long term. So what if the recession happens in 10 years? We tell you we are substantially better because a national reserve means we keep out of debt. All the same stuff about jobs applies, all the same stuff about subsidies applies. We are in a far better place 10 years, next year, when that recession happens. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite us the second speaker of the negated stand.
This one. Yeah, that's it.
When a young single mother is forced to have to starve and live on the streets because the government is too busy chasing the shadow of a potential disaster that could happen at any moment, is like a world where no one actually ends up benefiting, because in the current system where there is no crisis happening at the exact moment, we have people not affording to even survive. On our side of the house, we defend people in times of normalcy, which are a lot more likely. The likelihood of there being a crisis that could be ending the entire economy of the country is extremely minimal. So why then should the government be focusing so much of their effort and time and resources into a small potential problem when there is a current cost of living crisis where no one can afford anything because everything is so much more expensive. Okay, 3 things in my speech today. Firstly, on which side actually gets benefits for the consumers in their day-to-day life and in times of crisis. Secondly, on which side has better economic stability in the long term. And finally, on the impact. I'm going to split and talk about the impact on producers. Firstly then, on the benefit of consumers. So first of all, let's look at what a consumer actually is and what they're truly scared of, right? If I pull off someone off the street right now and ask them, are you scared of not being afford to like your meal tomorrow morning? Or are you scared of the potential crisis that the government, that someone could like have a recession in the future? They're likely going to say that they're more afraid of the current impact that they could be facing, right? Consumers are more afraid of like not being able to afford stuff now. We are the side that actually gets current impacts on them. We are the side that actually gets stuff easier for them. Why is this? We have given you multiple reasons as to why we get lower prices. Here are a few more. So firstly, we just overall have more competition on our side of the house. When we lower the barriers to entry for the things, we see in the motion already that we see that like an efficiency market looks like lowering barriers to entry for trade and for investment. This overall encourages more people to be coming into stuff because it is easier to be investing in these stuff and easier to be trading. So therefore, they'll be competing to lower prices, right? There's just going to be simply more people, and the only way they're going to be attracting consumers is by having lower prices, which is overall really good for the consumer because now they can afford to buy their next meal. We also see that they can allocate their the country allocates their resources for things where they have a comparative advantage and produce things at the cheapest price. So this looks like New Zealand investing in the agriculture business rather than actively trying to produce phones because we want to be self-reliant, right? We see that we're actually doing what we are good at and collaborating with the global economy to actually get what we need at the cheapest possible prices, where the consumers, again, will be benefiting. They told us that producers want more money, so we just don't get higher prices. Now this is just not true because they want to be making the most amount of money. They price things lower so that more people buy it on our side of the house. The way they make more profit is when they get more buyers and more consumers, which is why it is likely then they're going to be lowering the prices. Okay, I'll take a point.
Yeah. Do you think the poor prefer being unemployed and starving or just barely scraping by?
On our side of the house, we don't have them unemployed and starving in the ways that we have more businesses, we have more jobs overall, as mechanized to you at Katie, because there simply are more businesses, because people aren't afraid of like the current economy. On their side of the house, we see people losing jobs because every single business is afraid of a potential risk in the future where they're going to be like minimizing all like the money they're spending. They're going to be taking money away from like spending and trying to focus more on making profit to save it. This looks like then cutting unnecessary workers, which is really harmful to the consumers because they now lose their jobs because now there's a lot of job cuts. We saw this in times of crisis. If we try to do this on their side of the house, we will see unnecessary job cuts, which leads to more people starving on the streets. We are the side that actually cares about the consumers and has that poor single mother affording to feed her children rather than her actually like not being scared for the future. They tell us that people like on their side of the house, people are going to be saving. Now, if you want to believe that this is true, why is this overall really harmful? Now, if every single consumer starts saving, no one is spending money, making the economy as a whole stop, which leads to a recession. On our side of the house, we are having people spend money because they have trust in the products they are buying, moving the economy as a whole, where we get better GDP on our side of the house. Moving on then, and as to why we get better economic stability. Now, we are the side that tells you how we get current actual action where people are spending money as a whole. They have the jobs, as proven to you throughout this debate, where there's no job cuts and they are making the money and they're like affording stuff. Once more people start spending money and not saving, as seen on the affirmative side of the house, we see that the economy just overall gets more stable due to there being movement as a whole. When New Zealand actually starts exporting more and importing more, we get more global stability, we get more economic stability in the way that our GDP increases as a whole, right? So in the long term, this is beneficial on our side of the house in the way that like in the future, if there is a crisis, we are more stable because we are having more production as a country. We are actually focusing on the stuff we are good at rather than trying and failing to actually produce things that we will never, ever be able to do. They tell us, They tell us that people want to be. They tell us that people in like 10 years will be like suffering because like the government will be spending more on recovery and less on this stuff. Now, why is it that like we don't actually see a reduction of debt on their side of the house? So they told us that like the government's going to be saving money and reducing debt. This is untrue because in the case of a crisis on their side of the house, where they're spending so much money on subsidies, even if we want to buy, they're going to have like the government doesn't have international debt. They're going to go into more debt when they have to spend so much money on subsidies and like so much money to ensure these businesses stay afloat, right? So on their side of the house, we see there still is debt in their case, there is debt in the way that the government has to be spending so much money on these subsidies. And even if you do want to believe at the worst case that the government's debt does not change, this is simply not important, right? Because we care about the people on the ground, the people who are starving on the streets and are unable to afford anything at all. So this is just overall proofs to you why on our side of the house we just get even more economic stability in the way that we're just proving to you why in the long term we have it better. Finally, I'm going to split to you and talk about why we have better impact on the producers. So on our side of the house, they're able to pump out more output and like on the side with the efficiency policy. This is seen as like with the cost of production decrease, considering that we're pricing everything by the allocation of production based on comparative advantage, right? So they'll be able to produce more because everything's cheaper for them to produce, as we saw before, where we're investing in things we actually are good at. We also see that we even get better, like the producers can produce better things because of the more competition. We see that they actually have an incentive to be innovating. There's going to be increased competition, and they're going to want to gain as many customers as possible. So the way they do this is by actively working hard to have the best products produced at the lowest possible prices so they can attract as many buyers as possible. We also see that there is an increase in producers in general, such as small businesses, because due to the lower barriers to trade and investment as seen already in the motion, we will see more people capable of even trading and starting their own businesses. We also see that more people will be investing in these businesses because there's just lower barriers to be entering this stuff. The impacts of on affirmative side, the business stops as a complete whole because everything is made more expensive and no one can afford anything. Like in the best case, we have the highest businesses continuing as is and all the small businesses drowning completely. The impacts of this then is we see higher quality products on our side of the house and just more buyers as a whole because there's higher quality production for affordable prices. Since we are the side that actually stands with helping consumers and ensuring our economy stays stable, we are the side that wins the debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third speaker of the affirming team.
On their side of the house, profit-driven international CEOs are going to be the people controlling our country. Why is this true? Because when they open up trade, when they want more competition, this inherently means that because they're not subsidising local people, they're going to get these profit-driven CEOs coming in who are willing to spend this money up front, who are going to then be importing more because they want to open up importing. This means that we're now more reliant, and that will result in worse incomes for the poor because these people do not care about them. I'm going to go into detail later on why this is true as well. Right, so let's get into this. Firstly, on the economy. Secondly, on consumers. Right, let's get straight into it. Firstly, on the economy here. Basically, what they told us is that they get more output, they get more GDP. This is great, they get employment, more business. I'll touch on individual things throughout this, but just to start off, we would just like to point out, right, who is more likely to increase the number of locally owned businesses? The person who's actually subsidizing them, ensuring that they will always get a profit, and ensuring that no matter what happens, they can be sure that they are still going to be able to stay afloat until they get on their feet and get past this initial barrier. Or the people who are just going to give them some tax breaks, but when things actually get rough, when we go into a terrible recession like we're going to get on their side of the house, like we've proved, they then get no support and they're forced to fail. Even if they manage to lower the barriers to entry, they're not able to keep these businesses in competition and actually still supplying us when we go into crisis. We think this is hugely important because this ties into the jobs, which I will outline as I go through my speech. Alright, so what do we see here then? Basically, they told us that on their side of the house, producers aren't going to need to cut costs right? And that they're just not going to need to cut them because they have so many producers. Why is this not true? We tell you that it's not likely that they're actually going to be able to increase the number of producers during a crisis. I've literally just outlined this to you in the mechanisms. We've also given you mechanisms at first and at second on why we don't believe that they would even be able to get these people in the first place, right? They then told us that they're going to be less susceptible to price things. We tell you that this is just not true. They didn't mechanise this at all, and I just really like to flag that they cannot claim any outcomes because they just didn't mechanise anything here. We'd love to hear why they think that. Alright, then they told us that we're not going to have enough money to subsidise during a crisis. We do when we're reducing the number of crises and we're reducing the severity in which they impact us. We brought you material at first about why this is so true, about why when we have a more stable economy, we're able to better control the inflation rates, we're able to reduce the severity of the crisis, and we're not experiencing the crises that international businesses, which on their side of the house they would love to import more from, when we're not so reliant on these people, when we're not importing as much, we experience less crises from them, therefore less overall. Also, this is literally the point of reserves, where we are going to have the money because we're building up money over time. On their side of the house, they're never going to have the reserves, which impacts consumers, so I'll touch on that again later, just note that. Alright, finally here, about debt, they basically said we're going to get more debt because we're spending more, they're going to get less debt because they have more income. Sure, you might have more income in the short term, maybe. What happens when you go into crisis? Well, people weren't saving in the first place. You now have international CEOs coming in, capitalising on the tax breaks and all of this sort of stuff that you want to prove. We'd love to hear why you think it's going to be locally owned New Zealand businesses who can get into this. We just do not think this is true, right? This then means that they have less reserves to pay for things. On our side of the house, because we are subsidising, we're able to keep prices lower. This means that during a recession and when inflation rates are really high, we're actually able to keep prices low, so less people have to go on the benefits. This is great for us because now we're not spending as much on these. We have a large amount of reserves. We don't have to pay for debt, and even if we do have to pay for debt, so do they. They still have to pay for benefits for people on the lower end. They still have to do that. On their side of the house, it's all going to be debt. On our side of the house, at the very least, we have a cushion. We're able to reduce this, which means that we're able to recover faster and get the money back faster to grow our economy in the long term. And we think this is hugely important. We actually don't necessarily think that the economy is the most important part of the debate, but it definitely frames the second part, so I would just like to highlight that. But on our side of the house, we're able to actually support people both on the ground and the businesses because we have this reserve, because we're reducing the number and the severity of the crises that we are going through, and because we are not as reliant on importing and on international imports as they would love to tell us. Right. I'll take a point of information now before I move on.
Do you not think that when everyone starts saving and the government starts hogging money, this brings a recession a lot closer since no one is spending?
People save during different times in the economy. You're going to exacerbate that when you go through more intense highs and lows in the economy, and people just aren't going to be as aware on your side of the house. Moving on to consumers, where I'll touch on that a little bit further. Right, what have they told us here? Essentially, they've told us that people are going to be better because they're going to have more jobs and they're going to lower prices. I've already outlined why they're not likely to get lower prices on the economy point, but let's also look at this a little bit more, right? It's not likely to be internal. I've explained to you why it is not likely to be internal businesses. Secondly, even if it is internal businesses, they are profit driven. They're not likely to lower the prices even if there is competition, even if there is tax breaks. We don't see this happen. We just don't see this happening. We don't think this is true, and they have not mechanised why it is true on their side of the house. They then told us that we're going to be able to get the cheapest things, which is great for consumers. We don't necessarily think we have high tariffs on things like medical equipment. We really don't think this is true. We don't think we're going to be lowering medical bills significantly because we don't think we have high tariffs on these things in the current system. So we really don't see that they can claim any of their harms on their side of the house. Also, there are huge harms in buying the cheapest products in the market globally. We think that we cannot stand for this on our side of the house. If they want to stand for buying the cheapest things globally, go for it, but we really can't support the environmental and all of the social harms that come with that. I don't think we need to outline that because it's not a big point of this debate. Right, moving on then. Basically, what they told us next is that the barriers are too high in the current system. We have this monopoly. We're never going to be able to lower prices, which is really important to consumers. This is just not true, right? We told you why we're not currently reducing trade on products. We told you this is actually not something that we want to do. It was not one of the policies that we want to put in place. It is not part of this debate. Even if we are forced to, we really don't think we have a lot of key technology that we're selling off, and we don't think that we're reducing any sort of agriculture thing. This is just not part of the debate. So all of the material around this just falls out. Next on this, we think that subsidies actually help smaller businesses who don't have this overseas investment. This means that we are able to break up these monopolies on our side of the house. We're able to get lower prices to consumers, and we're able to benefit them in that way. Next, they brought us a little bit of material and their split on why businesses have the incentive to innovate, right? They told us that being locally produced, that it's going to be better than locally produced stuff. Once again, the thing here with like medical stuff, we really don't see how this is relevant. We'd love for you to explain to us why you think you have high tariffs on medical equipment, or how New Zealand is somehow going to innovate this. Right? What is locally produced? Usually it's agriculture stuff. There's not a lot of innovation that can go on here. We also think that the innovation that can go on faces much more extreme pressure from other things. We think that the main innovation here would be environmental, reducing carbon costs. We think this is just like not something that a monopoly solves. We think this is outside pressure and is not part of this debate. They don't even want to try diversification on their side of the house. This is not something they can stand for. We outlined to you at first why we get more diversification, which means in the long term, we're going to get more innovation, we're going to get more competition because we have more people doing this. Right, lastly, on the whole thing about like single mothers and all of that, what happens to the single mother when she has not been focused on the future, when she has no support from the government, when the government cannot pay for her benefits, and when businesses cut workers because they're afraid of a recession? This only happens on your side. On our side of the house, businesses are not going to cut workers because they know the government is protecting them. These businesses don't have to shut down. They don't have to cut workers. We see that on our side of the house, they're still going to get their benefit, their benefit on like the everyday level. If people can't afford bread, they can afford a benefit. The government can afford this on our side of the house. They still have a job on our side of the house. We see that there's not much difference here. And in the long term, what this looks like is if you're being employed by a company who's importing to New Zealand or exporting to New Zealand, when we go through a crisis and these things have to shut down, look at COVID, the single mother loses her job. She loses all of her streams of income. The government now has no money to protect her, and this just does not benefit her in any possible way. We're able to better benefit both consumers, producers, and the economy because we're able to create stability and we are able to create better long-term effects for these people. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third speaker of the engagement team.
We highly doubt that the token single mother that's been discussed in this debate will appreciate being told that she has to suffer for a couple more years, all in the name of, oh, there might be another pandemic, or oh, there might be another stock market crash. The fact is, the most important thing is letting the people on the ground be able to access basic necessities now, because at the end of the day, that is literally a matter of survival. People need to be able to put food on the table and put shelters over the heads of their families in order to survive now, no matter what happens in the long run. If we don't have these people in a stable position from the current day, we never have any stability in the long run. We win on both paths to victory in this debate. A couple of things to cover. Firstly, on the impacts to consumers, which we tell you is the most important thing because they're the most vulnerable people to things like cost of living crises. Secondly, on the impact to businesses, and finally, on the impacts to government. But at the top of my speech, I'd like to just give some weighing on what's the most important thing here. We tell you that the crisis we are actively amidst should matter more than any potential harm of an entire global pandemic or huge stock market crash. Allowing people to prosper today increases their capacity to be prepared for a crisis on the one hand, but also just on a matter of likelihood, we know that there's a crisis occurring now. It makes more sense to care about that now because we literally know that it's occurring. There's no actual likelihood analysis on why we're actually going to be having such often crises, or why that actually has to be such an important thing in this debate. We give you a lot of analysis from first that never faces enough
On that,
response about why never actually makes it clear why the scale of their harms are mutually exclusive or even important in this debate. Okay then, firstly on consumers. What do we hear from F? We hear that consumers, since they're confident on our side, they're going to be saving more, and that's really bad for the economy. Katie already gave you two really good responses on firstly why, regardless of confidence, the most vulnerable people in our society probably aren't saving that much anyway. But secondly, lots of saving isn't always good for the economy. It just leads to less growth, less employment. That obviously is going to be harming these exact vulnerable people more on their side. But a new response I'd like to add is that people literally earn more on our side. The government is incented to decrease taxes because they want to incentivize workers to be in the economy to increase efficiency. Obviously, that's the whole point of this debate. So we tell you that people literally earn more on our side, and so can have more capacity to save on our side. The second thing we hear, which is briefly mentioned at first, but then apparently weighed really highly at third, is that they get more diversification. We tell you that we get diversification when we actually access international technology and goods that New Zealand simply doesn't have the capacity to produce efficiently. New Zealand can't just produce whatever we want just because there's a subsidy in place, right? That's where this whole thing of comparative advantages comes into place. The reason that we're able to make dairy so well is because we have arable land because of our rivers, providing silt and stuff. The reason we're so successful in tourism is because we have these natural beauty that we can offer. And so the reason that we rely, or at least engage with other countries, is because they can provide things more efficiently than we can. They can provide them at a higher quality and a lower price to our consumers. The next thing here is that they try to claim our benefits on competition lowering prices, and no, this is pretty much their only way to actually prove that they get lower prices. Firstly, here we tell you that F literally gets a decreased competition. Firstly, I think the info slide literally just says that our side is incentivizing competition and their side is sacrificing competition. But also we tell you that when the government is spending on things like natural reserves and subsidies, there's less to spend on increased incentives to compete and barriers. And we also tell you that F literally gets monopolies, which is the opposite of competition, because they don't do any work to decrease these barriers to entry. Monopolies have full market control. They charge the high prices. We literally flip all the material here. But even if they get somewhat lower prices, we tell you we at least get a greater degree of lower prices because we can access inputs from international firms who have their own comparative advantage. I already analysed this earlier. We tell you that they can charge lower prices because they can produce things at lower cost. And thirdly, even if they fully get lower prices, purely on the method of competition, how do we still win this debate even if we don't get more competition? Firstly, we tell you we still get cheaper prices in several ways, which were just completely unresponded to, down their case. We gave you so many mechanisms at first. We access more efficient nations' goods, these more efficient nations' goods. We also tell you we literally decrease tariffs that decreases the cost for these producers, hence decreasing the price. Their side necessarily doesn't get these benefits because the basis of the resilience that they're defending is reducing incentives to trade. Secondly, we tell you we get higher quality, and that's how we benefit consumers, because we also get innovation in other ways. Incentives to trade technology that New Zealand can't produce on their own only exist when we're engaging with other countries. They can't just tell us that they still get innovation because they have more competition. They don't engage with the fact that different countries produce and can innovate to different capacities. But thirdly, we tell you we literally just have more goods available due to increased output, which is the basis, obviously, of what we're defending. This actually minimizes inflation because supply has the capacity to rise in line with the demand that's rising. That's when you don't get inflation, when you're actually able to just grow the economy. That's how economies grow. That's how we benefit consumers in the long run. So then, since we're able to A, prove that we get more competition, hence lower prices, but B, win in 3 ways, even if you buy the material about having more competition, we clearly benefit consumers here. Next then, on the considerably less important point about producers, what do we hear? We hear that firstly, producers have a guaranteed income through a subsidy. Firstly, a subsidy simply does not guarantee an income for producers. They only get this money when they're producing and selling the goods. But secondly, even if they get an increased income for producers, consumers not being able to purchase these goods because they're too expensive completely outweighs this material because of A, the vulnerability of consumers who's literally in a life or death scenario whether or not they're putting food on the table, but B, on scale. There's way more consumers there are in the world than there are producers who are who need to make profit. The next thing we hear is that the only thing that small businesses care about is that they're scared of recessions and won't join the market if there's a chance of a recession. Before I move on, I'll take it.
When foreign nations undergo recession, who is harmed more? A nation that trades with them a lot or a nation that doesn't?
We tell you that firstly, it's unlikely that these places are going through recessions that often. And like even if the country that trades with them more is slightly more harmed, we tell you that all the benefits you get in the 99 out of 100 years in which there isn't like these major global recessions outweighs that. That's when you actually get people being able to be prepared for these recessions because they earn more income down the line. We tell you that that outweighs your material in your best case. So then on the stuff about small businesses being scared of recession and hence not joining the market. Firstly, we tell you that small businesses care about literally being able to earn a profit in the market. This only happens when the economy is stable and consumers we know are going to be purchasing goods and hence giving these firms a revenue. Note they tell us for you that we get a more confident economy. That necessarily means that we get more spending in the market, which means that we get more firms joining because they can actually make a profit. Secondly, even if these firms are scared of the recession to some extent, the available benefits to be made from producing in a confident economy just allows you to prepare for these recessions to more of an extent. The last thing here is on the government's spending and their debt. Note that this isn't the most important thing in the debate because A, not a lot of time is spent on it. It's only their split point which they spend a minute on. But B, it's just not the most vulnerable actor in this debate. So we hear that when you have a natural reserve, you can get yourself out of the debt. We tell you that in the long term, we're the side that gets the stronger GDP. We can more prepare the country to actually pay off their debt and engage with the foreign market. We tell you that since we're able to benefit consumers in this debate, we will. Thank you.
Thanks for speaking for their speech. Now, in time-honoured debating tradition, we are going to flip the speaking order, so I would like to invite the reply speaker from the negating team.
In the current New Zealand, people do not have the ability to buy basic necessities, or at least a very large proportion of the population can't afford those good products or things that are nutritious for them. Planning the economy right now in fear of a crisis further on that happens once a century when you have something as big as a global pandemic is really insensible when you should be focusing on what you can get for the consumers now and how it will benefit them in the long term. Firstly, on how consumers are benefited in the current New Zealand, then secondly, on consumer benefits in the long term. The main push we got from side affirming was that producers don't want to put prices down because they want to make money. We flipped this because we told you down the line that producers want to lower prices so that more consumers can get the amount of profit they want, right? The second push was that they get more diversification. We told you throughout the debate that this is very untrue because a diverse economy is when you have as many products and as many businesses in there as possible. We get the access to foreign goods that we told you down the line and we pushed at Nakash. This is where you get that diversification. This is where you have a more stable economy. In times of crisis, companies have the incentive to cut costs, and they do this by cutting jobs, right? On our side, where there are more of these, we see more jobs available as a whole, that people can actually get jobs in the first place. In the current crisis, it's very hard for people to find jobs because there are no businesses afloat. If prior to this we were able to diversify our economy, we were able to have more businesses stay afloat in the first place. Now secondly, on consumer benefits in the long term. So much of affirming's case contingents on the shadowing economic crisis that is already so unlikely, right? Because firstly, we aren't going to be hurt by a huge global pandemic or a huge stock crisis like in the near future. It happens once a century, and even if this happens, we'll tell you how we deal with it better. Firstly, they told us that people become too confident in a booming economy. Now, even if you believe that people do stop saving because somehow our booming economy makes people stop being economically smart, then we tell you that, and a huge economic crisis does hit, we firstly tell you that these businesses have been able to get a large amount of money that they conceded to, right? They're able to more likely stay afloat on our side of the house. Secondly, the government has a greater or higher GDP that they can put into benefits and subsidies if required, right? They can pay off these small businesses if they really want to. I think that the material here on small businesses in a time of crisis weighs very little because of the amount of consumers to the businesses themselves, right? The consumers are the average people. Lots of businesses, they have the huge corporations. They're going to stay afloat in this economic crisis. They don't need the subsidies, and we think the government probably prioritizes subsidies to these ones that make them a lot of money in the first place. But then also we tell you that the New Zealand government, they gave these small businesses subsidies in the status quo. Majority of the small businesses failed anyways, right? This is because the minimal reserve you can give to so many small businesses looks like a couple $100 a week. This probably does not push out all of their big costs in which they're making very little profit, and rather in a couple in the best case, they get a couple small businesses actually getting that change and being able to stay afloat with that few $100. Maybe it pushes them over the boundary. We tell you that this is incomparable to the amount of consumers that are harmed on their side of the house, right? When a couple small businesses don't stay afloat on their side, this means that they have employees that fall. This means that consumers fall. Consumers, if we want to talk about the single mother again, there's so many single mothers aren't able to pay for this, whereas if they're a couple of small businesses fall, they have a greater capacity to actually be saved. When the government has more money, the economy around them has more money, so there are lower prices.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Now to close us out for the in-rounds of Nationals 2024, I would like to invite up the reply speaker of the affirming team.
I'd like to say hi to my single mother watching this debate. Anyways, the opposing side today tries to weigh the harms of their side out of the debate through the likelihood of crises, and they try and do this dodgy long-term, short-term analysis to say that there is no alternative. Theirs is the only side that helps consumers in the short term. In the final speech of my time at Nats, I'm going to be telling you about businesses, I'm going to be telling you about consumers, I'll show you how we win on the short term anyways, and I'll show you how we win on the likelihood anyways. So, on businesses, what they say is that businesses can lower the costs if you reduce tariffs, and businesses can make more choice if you make it a more competitive environment. What we say is that actually they fail to mechanize how this actually works, how they get more competition, and even if they get more competition, why does this result in good enough choice? We take them at their best and say, even if you get more choice, it's probably not going to be that great. Riley told you this, I told you this, we gave you heaps of mechanisms. On lower costs, we told you that actually they can't lower the costs because on your side, they're more afraid. Business confidence is a big thing for a reason. Even if they can lower the costs, they just don't want to because cash money $dollar. Even if they do want to, somehow, they really just don't care about broadening their market because it's going to be at a much lower cost. Stella told you that. I'll remind you again. And when they only touch upon our top mechanism of how we uniquely protect business confidence, they fail to win on this metric, so we win on this point. Secondly, on consumers. One more thing to flag. On business, they actually say businesses are scared of recession, so they cut workers. We think this is really important because that only happens on their side. If you buy that, and you buy that business confidence is even slightly better on our side, then buy their own material, we save the jobs of a bunch of workers, we get more cash money $dollar. Alright, now on consumers. What they say is that consumers need help now. Okay, maybe, but they fail to mechanize how they get help now. Deregulating these environments has never immediately worked, and they try and run away from their harms in the long run by saying that there's no alternative now. Okay, so I'll show you how we win on the short term anyways, despite the fact that they failed to mechanize how they actually help in the short term compared to the long term. We told you wealthier people's confidence and business confidence fixes in the short term when they see their own government creating a reserve, investing in them through subsidies, and literally just giving them money by all the help that we gave you for domestic production. So at that point, we win on the short term and the long term because we are the only side that helps when there is a crisis in the long term. Which brings me to the next thing. They try to run away from crisis through this dodgy likelihood analysis. If crises are so rare, why are we in one now? Why was the last one like a few months ago, seemingly? And if you trade with so many more countries, and you do that in a like much more willy-nilly manner, it's a given that there is always going to be a recession in a country that you are trading with, so you will always feel the consequences of that. We told you that, and that went broadly unresponded to. What we say is that on our side, people save because they know that they don't need that like extra bump of money for the next few days to get them through. They know they're not going to be overconfident as they are on their side because they are borrowing from tomorrow to make it seem like today is better. I'm sorry I have to take this. Kia ora. There's a recession on the way. Word just in from the beehive. Let's crunch the numbers. Who is better off next year in this recession that is coming? It is always going to be us because we have better business confidence. We have better investor confidence. So we win on the short term. In 10 years, who is better off? It is it the consumer on their side whose tax is hiked to pay debt? We told you this at me and Stella. Or is it the consumer on our side who has savings, as I mechanised for you, with a handy 80s politics example? Is it the consumer on our side who keeps their job because their government is making the right choices? Is it the consumer on our side when we look after the workers? Thank you.
I thank the speakers for their speech and would like to thank all speakers for what was both a great debate so late in the tournament and for a fantastic tournament overall so far. Now I have good news and bad news for you guys. The good news is that you no longer have to spend time deciphering whatever the hell that intro slide said. The bad news is this is a silent round, so you will not be receiving a result and you will not be receiving an OA, so whatever you do from here is totally up to your coaches. I invite you to cross the floor, shake hands, bump elbows, whatever you want.
I really assassinated myself.
Yes!